What I want to talk about, exploitation films of the 1970s, particularly Italian exploitation films, and look at examples of films that actually critically are really usually seen as trashy, ephemeral. Typically with horror cinema, depending on the kind of horror cinema we're talking about, horror cinema can often be discarded. And particularly when you move into exploitation cinema, where the idea is often that you're copying something that's popular and you're doing it via a kind of formula, and it's really a commercial imperative that's driving you, we often don't think that those kind of films can have any particular meaning beyond being silly, being enjoyable. We can celebrate them because they're crazy, because they're weird, because they're strange, and Offscreen has lots of those kinds of films, right? But often what we don't do is step back and say, actually, is there anything else in those films? Because no matter the quality of the film, no matter how quickly it was made, no matter the quality of the acting, what I want to suggest is it's possible to see within 1970s and early 1980s as well, exploitation cinema, a strand of actually directors or writers, moreover, attempting to address ecological concerns to some degree, but doing it really explicitly, not doing it in a way that we might expect to see, for instance, in art cinema, where it might be a much more metaphorical approach, but actually doing it in a way that is really literal and really in your face, but often so literal and so in your face that it kind of washes over us and we don't notice that that's what's happened. So I'm going to start off by just showing a couple of clips. I want to show a very famous clip from Frankenstein and also give you a little preview of the Crazies as well, which is showing later on this month at Offscreen. In each of those cases, what you have are human beings who have intervened in some way in the ecosystem, and usually there's been an exponentially catastrophic result at the end of that. So what we see with Victor Frankenstein is a man who's playing God, who's trying to create new life, but in doing so disturbs the balance of the ecosystem essentially, and what he creates is out of his control.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! Oh, in the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God! Oh.
Equally with the Crazies, and it's not too much of a spoiler, incidentally, to know the information you've just seen, but you know, it's about a small town, to fit in with what Emily was talking about, where the inhabitants slowly catch a kind of virus and go crazy and become psychotic. And as we've seen there, actually, this was something that was designed by scientists, and then they were kind of careless, and it got released with unpredictable results.
Why did this get down to the last minute? These diplomats should have been ready to move in here.
Well, the initial information was that the vaccine was harmless.
You mean they didn't take any precautionary action?
Routine procedure. I got here the day of the crash. Plane went down in these hills above the town. Investigators reported that the casings wound up in the river. Apparently, the water flows through an underground reservoir, and Evans City is supplied with artesian systems out of that. So I stayed in town, notified the police and the town doctor to be on the alert for any high fever symptoms or delirium.
Sir, the report was that the Trixie team had deactivated the vaccine.
Major, Trixie wasn't developed as a vaccine. Trixie was developed as a bacteriological weapon.
And that's partly what I want to dwell upon, is this idea of unpredictability and of exponentially catastrophic events that come from the scientific intervention into the ecosystem. Now, what I want to do in a moment is to talk about something called the precautionary principle, which is a kind of, maybe slightly old-fashioned now, but a kind of key tenet in terms of environmentalism. It's the idea of, if you cannot predict the consequences of what you do or what your intervention might be, that you probably shouldn't do it. So we could think about, for instance, something like genetically modified crops or animal cloning, for instance. That there were a lot of debates when those things began to happen about, actually, do we really know the consequences? What happens if something unpredictable happens? Think about, for instance, in Australia when they introduced cane toads. The introduction of cane toads in Australia was to get rid of a beetle that destroyed sugar plantations. Unfortunately, it didn't kill the beetles. It's not native to Australia. And actually, it destroyed various things in the local ecosystem. Things that previously didn't have a predator suddenly found they had this ginormous great toad eating them. And it was, again, unpredictability of what was going to happen. Now, a lot of the films that are showing it off screen, actually, evince exactly that kind of thing. So actually with frogs, the suggestion in frogs seems to be that it's to do with pesticides, and that there are pesticides being used to kill off frogs, but actually they have some other effect, some effect that wasn't predictable at the time. And we can look back environmentally at lots of things where this has happened, things like DDT, for instance, where it was actually causes cancer, but it was introduced for a specific reason, and then later we find out there are these potentially kind of catastrophic results. What I want to focus on today mainly is Umberto Lenzi's film Nightmare City. So Umberto Lenzi was a guest at Offscreen a few years ago. I want to focus on his film Nightmare City, interestingly called Nightmare in a Contaminated City in Italian. And if we have time as well, look at The Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue, which is one of my favourite film titles because it's neither set in Manchester nor in a morgue. Now, the reason I've picked these is because I'm almost trying to look at the sort of lowest reputational films that we can find that might actually deal with eco-horror and think about, actually, is there something more profound there? Italian genre films in particular, and Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue is Spanish-Italian co-production, but has Italian writers. They have a low reputation. They were caught up in the video nasties in the UK, which lent them this slightly dangerous edge, at least in the UK and in America. But also the directors who made these films typically would make dozens of films over a couple of years. They might make 5 or 6 films a year. They're working on things quickly. They've got quite low budgets normally. So we have special effects that are a little bit rushed and lines of dialogue that are a little bit naff. And I'm going to show you some of those in a moment. The reason I mention that is because these are critically unfancied films. These are films that are seen as trash. Now, we as an off-screen audience might embrace those films for all sorts of reasons, but typically these are films that are not seen to have any redeeming quality beyond being a little bit silly. Before we go on, what I want to talk about is just a bit of context from the 1970s. The 1970s is a really key era in environmentalism and environmental movements. So we have the foundation of Greenpeace in 1971, where you have, for the first time, a significant movement that is attempting to campaign, to take action against humanity's, well, I say man's, it's usually men, right? Man's impact upon the world and its ecosystem. There's the oil crisis in 1973, which throws into sharp relief the idea that the resources that we exploit around us, actually, when they're taken away from us, there are kind of serious consequences. We also have the 3 Mile Island incident in 1979, where a nuclear reactor, there's an accident and the nuclear reactor fails and we have a nuclear leakage. We also have, in 1976, in Italy, in the northern Italian town of Seveso, we have an environmental disaster where a chemical factory explodes, essentially, and releases lots and lots of dioxins into the air. And we have, I think, about 2,000 people that are affected in some way by this. And I'm going to come back to this and show you the effects of those dioxins a little bit later on, because they link in very intimately to Nightmare City. The other key thing that goes on, of course, in the 1970s is we have the Limits to Growth thesis in 1972 coming out of the Club of Rome, a report that's significant because it points out, really for the first time at least is broadly, that we may run out of natural resources, that the things we use when we turn on our heating, when we do anything, that actually that's not an infinite resource, it's finite, and that humanity has to then think about other ways in which it can get energy in particular. So that's a really crucial thing for creating debate in the 1970s. So you have in the 70s all sorts of disasters and then discourses surrounding environmentalism and action around environmentalism. These things are kind of floating in the air. When we think about film context, what we often think about is what happened the year before, what happened 2 years before. Academics do this quite a lot. Well, the year before, this happened, so that's significant, and that means this in relation to this film. We have to remember that these are discussions and ideas that circulate throughout the decade. So as we get to Nightmare City, which we'll talk about in a second, which is a film that comes out in 1980, we've had quite a long period of engagement with knowing about the issues we might have environmentally, but also knowing about some of the disasters that have happened. And there are a number of chemical factories actually that explode. There's one in the UK that exploded in a similar time period in the 70s. We have all sorts of environmental problems. The idea with the precautionary principle is laid out here by Andrew Dobson in his book Green Political Thought. So the book is a little bit old now, but actually it's a really, really good introduction to political thought in particular. Stresses this idea that, look, if you don't know what's going to happen, then don't do it. Now, the films that I'm going to talk about really stress and underline that idea, that scientists, those working in technology who are kind of allied with science, that what they do is they don't think about it. They're not cautious. They think, actually, this will give us energy. We'll do nuclear energy, and that will be fine. There are no problems with that. And actually, if we decide that we're going to introduce a new way to improve agriculture, we're going to have genetically modified crops, that's fine. There can't be any problems with that. The precautionary principle would say, actually, hold on a minute. You need to be kind of careful and think this through. So let's talk about Nightmare City. How many people have seen Nightmare City? One brave soul. Two brave people. One of whom is Dirk. That doesn't count. You don't count, Dirk. Okay, so Nightmare City follows this man we see here, played by Hugo Stiglitz. Hugo Stiglitz actually is a sort of Mexican actor, made famous actually more recently as a character name in Tarantino's film. He plays a character called Dean Miller, who is a reporter who is sent to the airport to meet Professor Otto Hagenbach. They always have fantastic names in these things. Because there's been a spillage at the local power plant. So Miller takes himself and his bad acting skills down to the airport, and he meets Professor Hagenbach. When he gets to the airport, he finds actually it's surrounded by military, and when Hagenbach gets off the plane, Hagenbach gets off, but so do lots of, they're called the infected, but they're effectively zombies. Now these zombies then kill everybody in sight, try to drink their blood to purify their own blood, which has been overtaken by this nuclear power spill, and they've become somehow kind of oddly radioactive, we presume. We don't need to know the precise technical details of that. What we then have, though, is because of this nuclear power plant that has had an accident, we have this infection, and we have this exponential problem where it's not contained. It's rarely contained. And it's really interesting what Emily said, because actually, in the two films that I'm going to talk about today, the endings are very bleak. They're very nihilistic. We don't have endings that suggest a return to order. The academic Andrew Tudor said there are horror films that we could call secure horror films, where at the end, there's a resolution and there's a kind of equilibrium that we get back to. Might not be the same place as before, but we get to a kind of equilibrium. So Christopher Lee is Dracula, Christopher Lee gets killed, and everybody seems to be happy again for a little while. In these films, that's not the case. I'm going to show you now the result of some of the destruction, some of the kind of craziness that goes on. Those are possibly the sleaziest zombies you'll ever see. But the point of this film is we have this incident, and then we have this exponential catastrophic event that happens. And actually, the spread goes from the city right out into the countryside. Now we have also within this a classic Dallas ending, in that Hugo Stiglitz, Dean Miller, wakes up and it's all been a dream. Except that when he goes to work that day, the day repeats itself, and we have a freeze frame ending at the end that says the nightmare becomes reality. Really explicit, really in your face, really very obvious in terms of what it's trying to say. Now, key to these kind of narratives is, and given the decade that we're operating in at this point, characters in Italian zombie films who try to suggest, look, we need to be careful. Look, I think the problem has been the spillage at this plant, or the problem has been this experiment that we've done, is they're ignored, or they're presented as being hippies and people who have kind of crazy ideas that aren't in line with the ideas that everybody else has. Because there's a rising environmental awareness, but there's also an awareness in these films that there's a resistance to that.
Ladies and gentlemen, from the Channel 5 newsroom. Top of the news this evening is speculation concerning the real facts behind the Department of Health announcement about a radioactive spill supposed to have occurred yesterday at the state nuclear plant. Information from an official source, which reached our newsroom this afternoon, stresses the seriousness of the situation, but at the same time provides a certain amount of reassurance. Damage caused by...
Hi, Miller. Mr. Desmond's waiting for you.
The arrival here expected at any moment of Professor Otto Hagenbeck, one of the original planners of the nuclear station, will undoubtedly enable us to obtain more precise information.
You heard? He's arriving tomorrow morning at 11. Take one of the best cameramen with you.
Why me in particular?
Because I want an exhaustive interview, which will reassure our viewers.
Not just the truth, pure and simple.
Forget the philosophy, Miller. Just do what you're told.
If possible, sir. Only if possible.
Okay, so I did warn you about Hugo Stiglitz's acting qualities. The key thing there, though, is forget the philosophy. So the presentation there is a sense there's resistance at this point, where any suggestion that we should change the way we live, or that the problem might be the nuclear power plant, is essentially don't be a hippie, don't get in the way, you're causing problems, and actually shut up. And actually the military come into the news station and try and shut it down for eventually trying to broadcast the truth.
Is it possible that you're not aware of the trouble that broadcast could have stirred up? Or the uproar that would have followed it?
I'm well aware of that, General Murchison. But I am a journalist, and my job is to keep the public informed.
Mr. Miller, listen to me.
Now, it's interesting here as well that the military are completely incompetent, and all of the plans they have fail. They cannot contain the outbreak of the zombies, and in the end, the zombies kill everybody, including Dean Miller's wife, and eventually we assume Miller himself, until he wakes up and the day repeats again. It's interesting because Miller says at one point,
all this had to happen to realize the truth.
And you have from that this sense of the kind of bind that you have, the double bind you have with environmental narratives, that in order to have an effect on people, in order to get your message across clearly, you have to suggest total annihilation, or you have to at least suggest something completely catastrophic. But by that stage, it's too late. So it's no good kind of saying, well, you know, we've introduced the zombies and people are now a bit scared and we'll get rid of them. Well, it's too late because, again, we can't control what's been created in this circumstance, because nuclear power plant has had an accident and then disaster has followed as a result of that. So there's a kind of desire by the filmmakers, I think, to suggest a narrative which is environmental and which is quite progressive, but it comes up against the fact that it's also trying to suggest to us that there's a barrier to that. There are problems to us kind of understanding that. I mentioned the Seveso disaster. This is a very famous picture by the Italian photographer Mauro Galligani of Stefania Seno. This is chloroacne poisoning, and that's what a lot of the victims of Seveso suffered from. So a lot of those 2,000 people that were affected when this big chemical cloud essentially flew over their village, they were suffering from chloroacne poisoning. Now, you may have seen this before, partly because if anyone remembers Viktor Yushchenko, the Ukrainian president, he was poisoned with chloroacne poisoning. But the makeup in the film, there's an explicit attempt, I think, to given this is an Italian film particularly, to ape the effects of chloroacne poisoning. It's an evocation of something that's happened before, something that is going to resonate particularly with Italian audiences. Now, these films were also made for export, but they're going to resonate with Italian audiences, and it makes those films a bit closer to the societies that produced them. Now, just quickly, I want to talk about Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue. So Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue follows George and Edna as they both meet on the way to travelling to the Lake District in England. So, as I said, don't go near Manchester, they don't go near a morgue. They're travelling to the Lake District. Whilst travelling, they come across a machine in a field, and George gets out of the car and asks the farmers what's going on.
You see, Doctor, the radiation works on the insect's nervous system. It drives them mad and they attack one another. I think we're going to see a real revolution in agriculture.
Not even DDT was this effective when it first came out.
DDT causes cancer. How about this?
Now listen, you've been on our backs since last night. Now, if you want to go back to nature, why don't you find yourself a nice Pacific atoll somewhere?
Sure. All I'd have to worry about then is atomic fallout. Thanks awfully, old chap.
What's the range of this machine?
Oh, about a mile at present. We're trying to perfect one up to 5 miles. But of course, this can't have anything to do with the children, now could it? It's absurd.
Now, Doctor, you're a man of science. Surely you can understand this machine has undergone the most stringent testing. The radiation only affects the most primitive forms of nervous systems, like microbes.
Not sure human systems are necessarily more evolved, but the key thing there is what this machine really does, apart from demonstrating a lack of understanding of the function of insects in agriculture, what this machine does is actually raises the dead. So all of the dead within a mile radius of this machine's operation come back to life. And we have Guthrie the zombie here, who's the first zombie to come back to life. Italian filmmakers and Spanish film genre filmmakers like to have these little jokes. Guthrie, I don't know if it's a Woody Guthrie joke or if it's just nonsensical, but it's called Guthrie anyway. Guthrie comes back to life first, and then we have a whole series of other zombies that come back to life. Now, you'll see in the clip there this resistance between the younger George and the institution, somebody from the agricultural department who has said, no, this machine is great, we've tested it in the lab and it's fine. Except, of course, when we introduce it into the ecosystem, we couldn't predict the results. We can't predict what's going to happen when you actually go live with it. And the result is, in this case, the insects don't die, but people become psychotic and people come back to life as zombies. So you have a kind of real stress on, or a real conservative approach to, a precautionary approach to the introduction of anything new into the ecosystem. And this is one of the key things in both of these films, that there's a stress on being really careful about what we do and the unknowable results of that. So you can test in a lab, but when you put it in a real setting, we don't know what's going to happen. We could have a laboratory and have cane toads, and we could see them eating beetles, and we could think, well, if we take them to Australia, that'll be fine, won't it? Except it didn't work because there are too many other variables. So there's that kind of precautionary approach which I think runs throughout these films. And the reason I wanted to talk about these examples in particular was because these are examples of films which are, often usually dismissed. They're often dismissed as being nonsensical. And it is true that the acting is pretty awful in, at least it's quite good in Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue. It's pretty awful in Nightmare City. But we have to move past that point and think, actually, is there something else that we can get from these films that we don't normally talk about, that gives us maybe a window into attitudes, ideas, ways of thinking about environmentalism in the 1970s? We're looking here at the sort of almost the lowest kind of form of cinematic life, if we want to think about it in eco terms. Just to finish by saying, with Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue, we have a freeze frame ending there as well. So the freeze frame is probably one of the least exciting freeze frames you will ever see. It's a freeze frame of the top of this piece of agricultural equipment. But there's a reason, because the machine is the thing that's the problem, or rather the people who put the machine there. But again, we freeze on that to suggest that open-ended narrative, that there isn't a resolution, that this is the thing we should concentrate on from this film. This is the thing that's been the problem. Don't be distracted by the zombies, but this is the thing that's really the problem. I'm not trying to argue these films are hidden masterpieces. I'm not trying to suggest to you these are deeply profound films that are deeply misunderstood. What I am trying to say is that actually we don't have to deliver a message in a way which is clever and metaphorical and subtle. Actually, it's still an important message, even if it's really direct. And that these films, if we look at these films and we think about them in these ways, it gives us some other understanding about films that were made very quickly, but actually where the writers of those films in particular, and sometimes the directors, actually were concerned about environmentalism. And it might have just been a hackneyed plot device, but actually if you look at the dialogue, it's really didactic dialogue. It's trying to tell us something.